Namaste, welcome to New India Junction. I am Nivedita Tiwari. We have with us today Professor Harsh Pant. We will be talking about India-China relations and the place of India in the post-COVID world order. Professor Pant is Director Studies and the Head of Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College, London. Professor Pant, welcome to New India Junction.
Thank you, Nivedita. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's begin with China. Given the current standoff between India and China, the volatile LAC, how do you view the future of the bilateral and the multilateral relations between India and China? If we can talk about BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
I think, in some ways, perhaps this is a point of reckoning in Sino-Indian relations. We have had our challenges in the past, where we have had problems which have been very, very difficult to resolve in the past. But a mixture of Chinese domestic compulsion and Chinese external aggression has made China today India's one of the most potent strategic challenges. And it is not simply a question that India is facing. It is a question for the larger global community. It is a question for the larger global order. And what kind of a global order are we comfortable with? So China challenge presents itself, along multiple axes. It's a bilateral problem. It's a problem of the larger global order. It's a problem of the multilateral systems. You mentioned SCO. There are many others in which India and China are part of together. You can go to BRICS. You can go to RIC. So the challenge is manifold. And I think what China has done, Chinese army has done along the LAC in the last few months, is perhaps to underscore the larger reality to many in India who were till then shutting their eyes, that China will never be a normal state. China will never be a normal neighbor, that it is the larger problem that China poses that in many ways is much bigger, much higher in salience than even Pakistan.
Yeah.
Pakistan's economy today is less than the size of Mumbai, where you are sitting. And so in a sense, there is no comparison. No one looks at India and Pakistan together in the same frame across the world. But with China, it's a different equation. China sees itself as a rising global power. In fact, it sees it as a power that has already risen. Most international actors look at China as a global power, almost very close, if not at all, risen almost on par with America. And the idea that China's dominance is leading to certain kinds of externalities that are not, that perhaps might not be very positively salient for the international order. And I think for India in particular, the historical legacy of border of the LAC presents its own set of challenges which we are grappling with today.
How do you look at the Quad then? Is it the new NATO with focus on the Indo-Pacific? And also, how do you evaluate its strength given the fact that the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Shinzo Abe, has stepped down from his position recently, and there is a political churn happening in the US politics? Also, if I may ask, what would Joe Biden mean for India if that happens?
One of the things that this crisis has done is to clarify for Indian policymakers some of the choices that they have to make. They can no longer postpone those choices. In the past, it was a case of, we will take one step forward, but we'll also be very careful that China should not be antagonized. That it is very important to keep China in good humor because China can create all sorts of problems. And we tried to be very careful. I think successive governments over the last several decades tried to be very careful. But the result is for all to see. The Chinese don't care one way or the other. They think that their time has come and they are pushing with all their might, making sure that India feels that pressure. So I think what the crisis has done, what the Galvan Valley incident has done, what the perpetual instability over the last few months along the border has done, is to make it very clear to the Indian policymakers that they have no option but to move along certain decision-making points. And therein lies, the relevance of Quad. That at one point, if you recall, in 2007, it was first enunciated. The idea came first, in being. And at that point, it was extremely, it was widely debated. It was extremely contentious. There were these wide-ranging debates whether India should do this, whether India should at all be part of it. And at the end, Indian policymakers decided perhaps India does not want to be part of it at that point in time because it might be too risky. China might get antagonized.
Yeah.
And not only India, other countries as well. Australians put their foot down. The result, today, Australia, India, both are at the receiving end of China. And since 2007 to 2017, this Australia-China relationship, India-China relationship went through lots of ebbs and flows. And it was very clear that China is going to be a very, very important challenge. So by 2017, automatically Quad was resurrected. There was an idea that, let's start reviving the Quad. Let's start talking about, let's have these four countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the US, talk about certain issues. But even then, there was an element of caution.
Yeah.
That let's not talk about hard power. Let's not talk about military aspect of the Quad. Let's talk about more softer aspects where we are talking of infrastructure, we are talking of connectivity, we are talking of economic issues, but let's keep hard power aside for the moment. Now what is happening is that we are actually seeing a sense where all four countries, perhaps for the first time, are on the same page and not only reviving the Quad, not only making sure that Quad becomes a serious enough element in the regional security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, but also get some real teeth.
Yeah.
So, we have just heard from the American Undersecretary of Defense saying that Americans would like it to be a NATO-like structure, the point that you were talking about. My own sense is that we are still some way off from that because the fundamentals among these four countries have to be resolved. And the biggest challenge here is going to be how do you reconcile the division between India and the rest. See, Japan and Australia and US have a very peculiar relationship. They're alliance partners. They have an alliance-based relationship with each other. India is not an alliance partner of any of these countries. India is just a strategic partner. India looks itself and has been vocal about. Indian policymakers have been vocal about not entering into hard alliances with other countries. So the question is, how do you reconcile these differences? How do you make sure that these four countries not only project a sense of purpose, but also their military forces, their defense forces, become more interoperable, so that if the need comes, they can also manage the hard security challenge that China is propagating, that China is mapping across Indo-Pacific. So I think in that sense, these are still early days, but the trajectory is very clear that if these four countries, if the larger Indo-Pacific has to manage China's rise, then it is imperative for these four countries to come together and create a regional security architecture. And Quad can be the nucleus, perhaps, of that architecture, which can later on incorporate other actors like ASEAN member states, for example. So clearly, there is a sense now that this needs to be done. This needs to be done quickly, and we will see greater movement along that front. The two reasons that you pointed out might lead to some delay. One is, of course, the American elections are happening, and we have to wait and watch what Mr. Biden's approach to something like Quad might be. I mean, my sense is it's not going to be very different. There are the US-China rivalry is at a point where there's bipartisan consensus today. And let's not forget that Mr. Biden himself was part of Obama administration, which was also talking of pivot to Asia Pacific. So they clearly have a continuity in their approach towards Indo-Pacific, towards China, towards India, towards Japan and Australia. And that is not going to change under Biden. The other element is Japan, where Shinzo Abe's departure certainly would make a difference. Mr. Abe had been a Japanese prime minister, unlike any other we have seen in recent times, very confident of Japan's role in Indo-Pacific, very confident of asserting that role, not only economic role but also strategic role. So we have to wait and see what the new prime minister Suga San might have to say about it, or how he would take the conversation forward. But again, given that he was Mr. Abe's right-hand man, we should expect more continuity than disruption. So my sense is this idea of Quad is here to stay. Its operationalization is going to happen pretty quickly now. And India, for one, would like that to happen. Unlike in the past, when India was one of the countries which used to drag its feet, today India is in a position, or India is facing constraints, and that has clarified responses in some ways for India and Indian policymakers, and therefore this conversation perhaps will attain greater salience and urgency.
Yeah. So an extension to that would be a question on what does the future of alliance building look like in the post-COVID world order? What are some of the foreign policy trends that one should watch out for?
Yes, I think the world has changed so rapidly around us in the last few months that again it's very risky if you were to try to decipher some of the trend lines. But I think certain aspects are very, very clear. One is the larger structural reality, that great power contestation is going to be one of the salient features going forward. Great power contestation, both in terms of China and the US, which has been developing over the last few years, especially under Trump, but also I think a new bipartisan consensus in the US that China poses the single biggest long-term challenge to American security, American prosperity, and American resilience. And along with that, it is not simply a matter now between US and China. It is also increasingly clear that China's rise is challenging other powers in the region in ways that we had not contemplated before. I mean, if 3 or 4 years back, you were trying to ascertain the trajectory of Australia-China relationship, no one would have foreseen the kind of dramatic collapse it has witnessed in recent years. India-China relationship, we had our problems, but again, the relationship was more or less on an even keel. There was a consensus around the parameters of engagement. All of those frameworks, all of those parameters have now been appended, are now in the air. India is re-evaluating most of the assumptions of its China policy, and I think that is something that the world will have to live with. So clearly, in terms of major power contestation, we are entering into a world where contestation is going to be very, very high, and that means that institutional architecture, normative frameworks that the world has created since 1945 will also be under tremendous stress. We already see some of that challenge. Look at how China exploited WHO in the early phase of COVID-19, and how the credibility of WHO has fallen in the last few months. WTO is no longer working, World Trade Organization. UN Security Council could not come up with a statement on COVID-19 because of great power contestation. G20 seems unable to come to a consensus on and they could not come up with a statement of their own, again because of China and the Western countries differing. So we have a very unique situation in terms of the larger institutional architecture, the normative frameworks which are up in the air. China is challenging them because China feels that it's time to challenge them because it is a rising power. It is a power that had no say when these institutions were constructed, were built. And the other powers are resisting it because countries like India, for example, have benefited from that institutional normative framework. So there is a the reluctance to let China get away with challenging so many of these formations. So I think this contestation will continue. The other element is going to be, multilateralism and its future, which is at stake today. Indian Foreign Minister Mr. Jaishankar is on record recently saying that multilateralism failed when it was most required. That was during the COVID-19 crisis, and it is quite remarkable. In the past, there used to be this argument that on non-traditional security issues like health, it's easier for countries to come together and work together. But look what is happening. Even on vaccine, we are looking at vaccine nationalism. Nationalistic tendencies are dominating the discourse. So the world is becoming more inward-looking, more nationalistic. Countries are first prioritizing their own interests much more explicitly than they used to do. Countries have always prioritized their interests, but I think what is happening today is something much more explicit, something much more contested, and therefore perhaps a fragmented multilateralism is where we are moving, where uh, coalitions of the willing will come together. So your question about alliances, I think we are not going to see formalization of alliances, but coalitions of the willing coming together on issue-specific areas. So, India's case is very, very interesting. India needs countries, we were discussing Quad, in the Indo-Pacific domain. But India also needs a country like Russia, for example, in the Eurasian context. So India's relationship with Russia will have to be looked at very, very differently than West's relationship with Russia.
Right.
So India, Russia, Iran, for example, relationship when it comes to Afghanistan, when it comes to Central Asia is equally important. So, perhaps we are moving towards a phase where coalitions of the willing will determine the outcome, will be the order of the day rather than hard alliances based on explicit, security partnerships. And therefore, India has articulated that India is no longer non-aligned, but is willing to align on based on issues. So I think that's a shift that has come. That's a change that we are witnessing. And perhaps that is going to be, one of the most defining features of Indian engagement with the world, but also perhaps the larger engagement. If you look at Indo-Pacific, there are no real, security. There is no real security architecture there. It's basically countries coming together through very various trilaterals, bilaterals, and quadrilaterals. So, what we are looking at is a shift away from explicit multilateralism that used to be the defining feature of post-1945 global order towards one where there is greater flexibility in the system, or states want to retain that flexibility to have partnerships and alliances. And the third feature, I think, which is perhaps going to be very, very significant, is this whole debate on globalization and deglobalization. I think the whole Francis Fukuyama argument of early 1990s, end of history, that the world will have now liberal free market capitalism and liberal democracy everywhere, that clearly has been found to be wanting. And we are now in a space where deglobalization is seen as something which is being defined differently by different countries. So whereas America says America first, India says Atmanirbhar Bharat. So you have a situation where this has become necessary because, again, you go back to that fundamental challenge of China, that every country today, most major powers today want to reduce their reliance on China, want to reduce the reliance of the global supply chains on China, so that this is resulting in this in this new phenomenon of deglobalization, which is becoming more and more potent. Countries, of course, are defining it differently, but my sense is that what it would end up becoming is a greater fragmentation in the global economic order. Something like, for example, UK has called for a group of democracies to come together and build the 5G network, work on 5G technology. I think that is what is going to be the order of the day when you want to keep certain countries out, but you also want to work with certain like-minded countries. Now, India is doing exactly the same thing when it is targeting Chinese companies, trying to firewall certain sectors from China, not allowing China to have a part in in certain strategic sectors in India. But this does not mean that India will not allow any other country. India is going to allow those countries with which it is comfortable. So I think political relationship increasingly will determine the logic of economic engagement, and not the other way around, as some believe during the high tide of globalization. And I think with given these three trends, great power contestation, multilateral fragmentation, and deglobalization, we are really entering into uncharted territory as far as global politics is concerned. Given what we have witnessed in the last few months under the shadow of COVID-19, it is very difficult to predict what the final end game might be, given that most countries for the foreseeable future would be dealing with a grave economic crisis, where lots of assumptions about that we had made about economic trend lines might also not be working.
So let's come back to China, and I think you also mentioned it briefly. Its hegemonic intentions are clear even in the global data space, right? Technology. And it's notorious for snooping, and we really cannot trust China. So, what are some of the concerns that one must be aware of when it comes to technology, the race for technological supremacy?
China has raised a number of questions about the way global order had been operating in the realm of trade and technology in particular. Because the fundamental argument in economics has always been about reciprocity. It's a logic of the logic of comparative advantage. To those who know basic economics know that if you are trading because you have some advantage and the other side have some advantage, and therefore if you mix and match, you come to a win-win situation. Both sides gain by trading off their advantages with each other. Now, what the Chinese have done is something very interesting. They gamed the system to an extent where they were not willing to open themselves up while forcing the other side to keep opening their doors, their markets, their laws, and their societies for China, and for Chinese companies, for Chinese students, for Chinese academics, for Chinese technologies. In the process, this uneven relationship meant that China benefited immensely. Now, Mr. Trump has a point when he says that China has exploited the system to its advantage. China, and therefore, and if you look at China's relationship with most countries around the world, this is the fundamental point that is increasingly now coming up. India is also making this point time and time again, that we want reciprocity in this relationship. Unless China delivers that reciprocity, we are not going to go back to status quo ante. So clearly, in a sense, the China question is interlinked with the way China has used the larger technological and trade and economic levers that it possesses. And in the process, it gained immensely. It became very powerful. And that power has been deployed in a manner that, that has been very consequential in a negative way for the global community. So we are when they talk of 5G and Huawei, why is it that countries around the world are not willing to trust China? Partly because there is a sense that China has allowed its companies to become a part of the larger state system. It's not that the Chinese companies operate as free market entities. They operate as an arm of the Chinese state, or they are asked to operate as the arm of the Chinese state. So this regulation, 2017 law, that forces companies to give data to China if required, means that you cannot really trust even a Chinese tech company that perhaps is not involved in the strategic sector, but at some point might be asked by China to give certain data. Now, the revelations that have just come out about China snooping, in some ways, that's quite normal. Countries do snoop on each other. You try to gain intelligence in other countries, but the scale and scope of this exercise is mind-boggling. That not only you have top-level political leadership being snooped upon, but you also have people like small-time panchayat members who are being snooped upon. So clearly, what China is trying to do is to gather data, is to monopolize data in ways and mine data in ways that might be used for strategic purposes. And that is where the problem lies. The sense that China is using trade and technology for geopolitical influence is something that the world, perhaps surprisingly, is now only beginning to come to terms with. And that means that even in areas where China and the world were engaging with each other, which are seen as benign, like academia, like students, that is now coming. We have had a number of cases now from various countries where academics of Chinese origin have been found problematic, have been dubbed as Chinese agents. There have been students who are seen as agents of PLA, and therefore America has tightened the screws on who can come to America to study. Now, this is quite, while it is reminiscent of the Cold War times, but even in Cold War times, the scale is not, it was not that, that huge, because the engagement between the two sides was not this interlinked. China and America have been interlinked in ways that Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and America were never interlinked. So that interdependence is now becoming a problem for the West, for America in particular, and that interdependence is being used by China for leverage. And that is the challenge that all countries now face. India also faces because of its economic interdependence, and therefore this logic of how do you reduce that interdependence. So I think what is largely happening in the trade and technology space is going to be one of the most significant developments, because of course on trade we can move to to deglobalization, as we were discussing, but on technology, which is going to be the frontier of fourth industrial revolution, which is going to define the balance of power in the coming decades. This is going to be the most important fault line, and this is where, therefore, you see a lot of contestation, a lot of effort by other countries to push back against China.
Yeah. Do you think Mr. Narendra Modi's foreign policy is a break from the earlier foreign policy, or do you think it's more of the same?
This in a sense is a debate that Mr. Modi brought with him to his office since 2014. And I don't recall any other prime minister and his foreign policy being discussed like Mr. Modi's foreign policy has been, both by the admirers and by the critics. Now, in some ways, perhaps it's easier to understand because Mr. Modi simply, is not simply a question of a change of prime minister, change of prime ministerial style from Dr. Manmohan Singh to Mr. Modi, but it is also a question of India as a society moving significantly to the center-right ground of Indian politics. And therefore, if you have this kind of a dramatic shift in any society, it gets reflected in its policies. Foreign policy is no exception. So you would see an assertion of certain issues, you will see an assertion of certain institutions, which you had not seen in the past. But my sense is that Mr. Modi has been able to articulate a vision for India, which is quite distinct from his predecessors. And in a sense, that vision, is rests on a few things, on a few related ideas. One, of course, the larger framework of non-alignment has been put to rest. That non-alignment no longer really matters in Indian foreign policy. That used to be the meta frame for Indian foreign policy. Today, non-alignment has really no legs to stand upon, and Mr. Modi's predecessors also used to talk about non-alignment, but in reality, the world had moved much beyond non-alignment. But they had an ideological devotion to non-alignment. Mr. Modi does not really have any, any commitment to the idea, so therefore he doesn't need to say it. But in terms of its operationalization, in terms of articulating an alternative vision, it's very clear that he remains one of the most pragmatic politicians and statesmen. The idea that India would deal with any country and every country if it serves India's domestic requirements. So by linking foreign policy to domestic policy explicitly, and by linking his developmental agenda to this idea that to achieve the developmental agenda, partnerships are important. In the past, the argument used to be that let's not get very close to some countries because that might create problems, ideological problems. And America was the biggest problem. The West was a big problem. But today, Mr. Modi, since the time he came to office, he has been traveling non-stop. He has been engaging with most countries at the highest levels. And he has been unabashed in terms of his embrace of the West and embrace of Russians. And I must add that even China, he gave a chance to China also. That despite Doklam, The whole Wuhan, the whole idea behind Wuhan was to see that China and India perhaps are areas there that the two can work together. So, in a sense, the logic of foreign policy that Mr. Modi has cultivated is this idea that foreign policy is inextricably linked to India's domestic requirements, developmental requirements. Therefore, it is very important. The critics who have claimed that why does Mr. Modi travel so much, and this idea that he's constantly showcasing India around the world. It's a bizarre argument to be very honest. India, if it wants to project itself around the world, should have its leader traveling and should have its leader present everywhere possible, on every possible global fora, and put in India's point of view should be put by India's top leadership in ways that Mr. Modi has done. So, in a sense, that older alignment and non-alignment debate is over. We are in a world where the Modi government is articulating a much more pragmatic engagement based on issues, based on partnerships, and partnerships that enhance India's strategic autonomy. So, in a sense, the whole logic that your strategic autonomy gets curtailed because you have partnerships has been turned on its head. Now, the idea is that you develop these partnerships, you cultivate these partnerships, because that gives India the strategic space that India needs to maneuver around difficult issues. And you see that achieving some very substantive results. You see that achieving results in Middle East, in West Asia in particular. You see that achieving results even in the case of the present crisis with China. And if you see how India has been able to manage both and get support from both directly and indirectly from the West, as well as from countries like Russia, it's quite significant. So, in a sense, that ability to maneuver around difficult issues by developing partnerships has been Mr. Modi's ability to shape India foreign policy in a certain direction. Is a function of his ability to shape Indian foreign policy in a certain direction. The other element is, I think, the whole of government approach, in a sense, that foreign policy, because it is linked to India's developmental requirements, is not simply about the MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, doing its job. It's also about Ministry of Home Affairs. It's also about MOD, Ministry of Defense. It's also about Economic Finance Ministry. So you have Commerce Ministry. You have multiple ministries, agencies, institutions that need to work in sync. And under Mr. Modi, we have seen this whole of government approach that has come into perspective. And this particularly looks significant when you think of India's ability in recent years to meld this debate between soft and hard power. While on the one hand, India has been under this government has been very open about pushing India's soft power on the global agenda. Yoga, there is India's traditional relationships in the Southeast Asia, India's religion and cultural diversity being projected in ways that perhaps allows India to engage with certain constituencies that it was not engaging with before. Projection of Indian diaspora across the world. All of these factors are relevant when it comes to India's soft power. But there is also the element that hard power is integral to how India will respond to certain challenges. So there was this reluctance to use hard power that had become part of India's national security foreign policy domain over the last 2 to 3 decades. I think that has been given a decent burial, because you are now witnessing the use of Indian military as a very important instrumentality, not simply in terms of defense diplomacy, which Indian Navy is particularly good at doing, but also in terms of responding to the adversary, responding to the challenge that adversary poses, whether it is Uri, whether it is Balakot. Those episodes are important in their own respect, of course, but they're also important because they give you a sense that India is willing to be proactive, India is willing to take certain risks, and India is willing to climb the escalation ladder in order to achieve certain strategic objectives. And I think that's a message that has gone out very categorically to India's adversaries. It is and as well as to India's friends,
Yeah.
that India will also use hard power when the time comes in the service of its own interests. And that is a very important message. So you see that, for example, the way India has shaped its recent engagement with China on the border, where Indian forces have been able to maneuver around China's very formidable military. You also see how Indian forces have been able to call Pakistan's nuclear bluff when it comes to terrorism and when it comes to Pakistani shenanigans. So there is a larger, I think, issue here about welding these soft power and hard power instrumentalities to achieve Indian foreign policy and national security objectives, which I think has been a very important hallmark. And I think, finally, I would say that just in terms of the larger neighborhood question, what I find as an observer very, very interesting is this, the sense that Indian foreign policy discourse has been unnecessarily burdened by the Pakistan question. India, that we are not comparable countries. We should not really be bothered about Pakistan, but for some reason, both in terms of a domestic discourse as well as in terms of global perception, it was always that India would be burdened by Pakistan legacy. This question of Pakistan problem will always going to be there. But I think what has happened in the last few years is India has carefully managed to get out of this rut.
Yeah.
That now Pakistan is a problem, Pakistan is a nuisance, Pakistan will be managed, and India has in fact marginalized Pakistan in Indian neighborhood discourse. India is more focused on Bay of Bengal, on its eastern neighbors, on from SAARC to BIMSTEC. This idea that India would like to see its neighborhood very differently by looking at countries like Thailand and Burma, Myanmar as its two important immediate neighbors, which is extraordinary in terms of the conceptualization, the reimagining of India's neighborhood, because it allows India not simply to claim leadership in its immediate periphery, but also to give allows India to make a case that India's relationship with countries like Myanmar and Thailand give it a unique vantage point to Southeast Asia. So there is a larger area where India perhaps can project itself, can project its power and its engagements and its relationships. And I think that's a very important message that has gone out to the world, that India will not simply be consumed by Pakistan related issues in the neighborhood. Yes, it's a problem, it will be managed, but India also has an ambition to have a footprint in the larger Indo-Pacific, which is increasingly the center of gravity of global politics. So in those multiple ways, I think Mr. Modi has tried to reshape and reconfigure Indian foreign policy. Of course, critics will say that this was happening before, and it's simply a question of style. But I think even if this is simply a question of style, then I think that style has had a more substantive impact on Indian foreign policy than perhaps the substance of the past.
Right. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you so much for that insightful conversation. Thank you for your time, for joining us on NIJ. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Nivedita. Thank you for having me.